We are live, folks. We are live. The Biden administration is scrambling to get something accomplished before the midterms. Their latest attempt at a piece of comprehensive legislation is labeled the Inflation Reduction Act. And despite the name of the bill, the legislation is far more to do with energy policy and increasing taxes than reducing inflation. Also, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis seems to have entered the fight against ESG. We're going to be talking about that and more on episode 357 of the In the Tank podcast. Welcome to the In the Tank podcast. As always, I am your host, Donald Kendal. And joining us for the first time since episode 343, back in late April, Justin Haskins, editorial director here at the Heartland Institute. How are you doing today, good sir?
I'm doing well. I've actually been listening to the show occasionally when I have absolutely literally nothing else to do. In particular, there was one time a couple of weeks back where I was driving across country because, of course, I've been moving, and I was driving through the mountains of West Virginia, streaming In the Tank podcast on my phone through YouTube. It was pretty amazing. It was cool. Technology is amazing. I thought the show was it was okay. But
that was good. It was that was the week.
Yeah, well, obviously that's why it was just okay. But yeah, no, the show's been great. You guys clearly don't need me. But here I am. So
also joining us, we have Jim Lakely, VP of the Heartland Institute. How are you doing today, good sir?
I'm doing great. I was the one hosting that show when Justin was navigating the mountains of West Virginia, which are beautiful, but really rough on yourself and your car. I've driven that. I've driven all the way across the country twice, and I found it easier to get over the Rocky Mountains than it was to get over the Appalachian Mountains. Those are tough, man. And so I'm glad to know, Justin, that my soothing voice as host and commentator here on the In the Tank podcast helped you not crash.
Yeah. Your rants is what kept him awake during those.
It was.
Long hours.
Who needs caffeine when you have Jim screaming at you through the sound system?
So we do need to catch up with Justin. Like I said, it's been a while since you've been on. But first, before I do that, I will put that message out there to our audio-only listeners who are probably catching this show on a Friday, that you can catch the show a day earlier if you join us live on Thursdays at noon Central Time. We'll be streaming on Facebook and Twitter and Rumble and YouTube and all of those things. So you can join in the conversation, leave your comments and questions in the chat there. And maybe we'll pull your questions up, address them live on the show, or we'll put your comments on the screen, something like that. And also, because we have two separate channels for this, and you can watch it on Facebook and Twitter and all of those different things, you might be chatting on something, whereas someone else is chatting on a different platform, and you're not seeing what each other are saying. So in order to kind of skirt that idea, if you want to participate in the chat, maybe you should go to the main Heartland Institute YouTube channel. That way you can see all of your fellow commenters and talk to each other, and we'll get a little bit of a community going there. But I will say that the reason why we have multiple YouTube channels is because YouTube said that we're going to destroy your channel if you talk about too much controversial stuff. So in an effort to not censor ourselves, we created the In the Tank podcast channel on YouTube. So if we're going to be talking about something that's a little bit more controversial and might have that threat of us getting our channel nuked, we're only going to host the show over there. But on a show like this, where we're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act and some energy policy stuff and ESG, it's probably safe to say that you could have your discussions going on in the chats on the main Heartland channel. But let's get into the topics, because we have a lot of stuff to talk about. But first, like I said, we gotta catch up with Justin here. So, Justin, the last time you were on the show, like I said, episode 343, aired on April 29th. On that episode, we talked about Elon Musk saying that he was going to buy Twitter. So that's how long ago that was.
Wow.
So what's been going on since then? We've got first off, why you been so absent? What's going on, man?
What isn't going on? I think that's the proper question. I have decided, because this is the way that I live my life, to jam in the biggest life changes I possibly can into the shortest amount of time conceivably possible to maximize stress, because that's when I get really good, is when stress levels are really high. And it's like the level right before you have a heart attack. You just back that down a little bit.
Right.
That's when you're at the top of your game, right? So all sorts of things. My wife and I adopted a baby, Theodora. We call her Teddy. She's incredible. So that's been probably the biggest life change. We don't have any other kids, so this is kind of our first time around the block. Donnie knows all about that because he's got a fairly young boy.
Right.
And so that's been pretty time consuming, moving across the country. My wife starting a new job. So it's been
literally
a lot
across
of
the
crazy
country.
stuff.
Let's not understate that, from one coast to the other. Like literally
3,000 miles, almost exactly 3,000 miles between towns. So drove it in 4 days, just me and the dog. So it was a lot of it was actually it was interesting. Yeah, and Jim rants.
That's
Jim was
right,
there
yeah.
too.
I'm your co-pilot there, not just the dog.
That's right. Yeah, and it was really incredible. I haven't done any cross-country trips before. I spent very little time on the West Coast, which is strange because now I live there. But I was really blown away by certain things. One was how really actually beautiful Iowa is. I thought I imagined Iowa to be very different than what it was, but it was lots of rolling hills and green, and it was beautiful. Nebraska, terrible, just a horrible. So I'm sorry if you're living in Nebraska, you like the show. I know you guys love freedom in Nebraska, but God, I don't know how anyone lives there. So that also, and Utah, when you go to Utah, it feels like you're in Mars or something. Like, it's like a foreign planet, that place, but in a cool way. I mean, I really enjoyed that. So there were some other stories that I could tell from the road, but probably not appropriate for this show. But it was all in all interesting to see many different states and to especially in the summer, because I think in the previous long trips I've done, it wasn't in the summer. It was gorgeous. America is a massive place.
Oh yeah,
it really is a massive place, and you don't realize it till you spend
45
hours in the car and you still haven't reached your destination yet.
Right.
Yeah. Well, by the way, Justin, female Kansas City KC Royals fan, lives in Nebraska, and so way to go. You've just alienated one of our regulars here. So female KC Royals fan, this will be the last time Justin will be on for at least a month. We'll put him on suspension for that.
That's right.
For saying that.
So it looks like you're getting all set up there. So hopefully you'll be joining the show a little bit more regularly like you used to. But we understand. We understand.
Yeah.
So what's been going on in the podcast realm since you've been gone, since your last episode? In the time you've been gone, we've covered the following topics and more, obviously. The SCOTUS decision on Roe versus Wade being leaked. That happened in the time that you've been gone.
God.
The rise and fall of the Ministry of Truth. Gas prices hitting all-time highs. The Davos 2022 conference. Raging inflation. And our latest poll results on the Constitution, the Supreme Court, and America. All of this stuff we covered extensively in the time that you've been gone. So that's just kind of gives you a sense of how long you've been absent from this show.
Well, the good news for Justin,
so when was the last time?
April 29th.
Wow. Okay.
Well, the good news for Justin is most of that bad news still remains. So,
that's right.
These are ongoing topics.
So I want you to comment on all of these items very briefly. I know that you've you've been preparing your notes despite the fact you're not on the show. So let's just go off one by one. Just your response to all of these items.
I honestly don't even remember anything that you just said. So you're going to have to read through them one by one if we're going to actually comment on them one by one.
We're not going to.
Yeah, I didn't think so. I didn't think so.
I
will say this. Have we found out who the Supreme Court leaker is yet?
Nope.
We haven't, right? No one knows.
Can't
figure that one out.
I saw this too. I think it was 93 or 95 days and still no word.
Yeah, there was a
That's
conspiracy going on in
amazing.
our comments section that it was you, and that's the explanation of why you were gone so long. But
no, pretty sure it wasn't me.
Look, if it's been 95 days and they haven't released who the leaker is, it's because they know who the leaker is, and releasing the name of the leaker is worse than not releasing the name of the leaker. Period. Yeah. That's what I think.
It was probably, what do you want to bet that it was probably one of the Supreme Court justices themselves?
I think there's at least 50-50 chance of that, I think.
It was like Sotomayor just decided, you know what, screw it. I'm going to call the whoever, some reporter I know or whatever, and I'm just going to leak it myself because I think this is a disaster. And who knows, whatever. The point is,
or a justice authorized the leak. They told their clerk, go ahead, do it.
Yeah.
Like it was done with the knowledge of somebody. It wasn't just done rogue, right?
Yeah. How could they not know? I'm sorry,
or if as soon as it happened, a justice, I know who that is. Oh, that was my gal, but they're protecting. I know the whole thing is fishy. Everything is fishy. We can't trust the government at all on any level, which is what a lot of this podcast is going to be about. So several Jim rants are coming.
Sorry. We do have a lot to talk about, so we should probably jump into it. We briefly talked about the Inflation Reduction Act last week, and we promised that we would talk about it more this week. So before we get Jim and Justin's deplorable take on this proposed legislation, let's have the bill described by the Senate Democrats. So according to their official one-page summary, which appears to be laid out on Microsoft Word, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 will make a historic down payment on deficit reduction to fight inflation, invest in domestic energy production and manufacturing, and reduce carbon emissions by roughly 40% by 2030. The bill will also finally allow Medicare to negotiate for prescription drug prices and extend an expanded Affordable Care Act program for 3 years through 2025. The new proposal for the fiscal year 2022 budget reconciliation bill will invest approximately $300 billion in deficit reduction and $369 billion in energy security and climate change programs over the next 10 years. Additionally, the agreement calls for comprehensive permitting reform legislation to be passed before the end of the fiscal year. Permitting reform is essential to unlocking domestic energy and transmission projects, which will lower costs for consumers and help us meet our long-term emission goals. The paper, the one-pager, touts $739 billion in revenue raised by 15% corporate minimum tax, increased IRS tax enforcement, and the elimination of the carried interest loophole. Investments totaling $433 billion in energy security and climate change, Affordable Care Act extension, et cetera, et cetera. This all amounts to a total deficit reduction of $300+ billion, all without having to increase taxes on families making under $400,000 while making the rich finally pay their fair share. So we are going to get into some details about this bill and kind of dissect this one-pager here. But I just want to start off first with the name. And we all know this, but this might be the most important aspect to your average American. The Inflation Reduction Act. So this puts Republicans in a position where if they vote this down and inflation remains high, Democrats are going to have ammunition to blame Republicans. Oh, inflation is high? Well, the Republicans voted against the Inflation Reduction Act, so it must be their fault. So this is kind of similar. This made me think of the anti-price gouging bill that was proposed a few months back, and we talked about that. Republicans opposed that because A, it would do nothing to lower prices, and B, it would most likely make those problems worse. But that didn't stop all of social media to feel justified in blaming Republicans now for higher gas and grocery prices. So, Jim, I've always said that the left is great at linguistical battles. Do you care to comment on just the name of this bill?
Well, it's standard operating procedure in Washington. What's Obamacare's official bill name?
The Affordable Care Act.
The Affordable Care Act. Now, is anybody listening to this podcast or watching this on YouTube? Have your healthcare premiums gone down in the 10 years that Obamacare was passed? No, it hasn't. If you own a small business and you provide healthcare to your employees. Has the cost of providing insurance to employees gone up or down in the last 10 years? It has skyrocketed. And so, yes, the Inflation Reduction Act, everything in this bill is going to increase inflation, increase economic malaise, and increase the cost of living for every American in the United States. Everything in this bill works toward that end. So our only hope now, Manchin caved, and we can get into that. He is not going to. People in West Virginia are very much against this bill, and there is a chance, I suppose, an outside chance that he may change his mind and actually vote against this when it comes up, because this will be happening in the next week to 10 days. And the last fail-safe to defeat what is basically Build Back Bolshevik light and lots of Green New Deal BS in this bill, as well as other stuff that will actually make inflation worse, is Kyrsten Sinema. She has there's something called carryover interest that discourages, you could tax it. It basically discourages manufacturers and other large corporations and companies from investing in their own businesses and encouraging growth. She's against that. That's in this bill. The worry is that they'll just take that out, and then everything else that's garbage in this bill will pass into law. So but she is still holding her decision on this bill close to the vest. She said she'll announce it. You'll know my decision when I vote on the bill. So it's going to be a dramatic time in Washington, I suppose. But that's the only chance. This thing is going to make a already horrible economic situation in the United States not just a little worse, much worse.
Yeah, Justin, I mean, Jim brought up a couple of things that I do want to dive into in a little bit more detail, but just comment on kind of the political angling of just naming this thing the Inflation Reduction Bill, when they fully admit that reducing inflation is just kind of a part of this. It's actually just, infrastructure and energy policy and all of that stuff.
Yeah, it's so Jim brought up Affordable Care Act before. And that was always, that's common. That's common. When they come out with a name for a bill, they often slap some sort of a thing on it. They usually make it some cute acronym too, if they can figure out a way to do that. I guess they couldn't figure out how to do that this time around.
The Patriot Act the Patriot Act's a great example of that. As a matter of fact.
Exactly. And so they love to do this. That's common. But this time, I guess what's different is that it really feels like a slap in the face with a sledgehammer this time, because it's you expect Barack Obama to say, well, I'm going to pass a healthcare reform bill and it's going to be affordable healthcare. You expect him to say that, right?
Sure.
But to pass a to pass a bill that's clearly more of a green infrastructure bill with some tax increases in it, and then turn around and say this is inflation reduction while we're in the middle of an inflationary crisis, and this obviously has nothing to do with inflation, is really just a screw you to people. Only people who are really, really ignorant or stupid or just believe everything that Joe Biden says, which I guess kind of falls into the two previous categories.
There.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap there. Would believe that. Nobody believes this. Not even Democrats believe that the name is actually what this thing is all about, right? So it really does feel kind of like a slap in the face. It would be sort of like if you passed a bill that said, the Helping Poor People Act, except the bill was designed to just hand out loads of cash to rich people. And it's just but it's the Helping Poor People Act. So I guess it just feels a little worse this time around, I guess. I don't know. A little more insulted by it than usual.
Exactly. And I just, that if it gets voted down by some miracle, this doesn't go through. Maybe it won't take a miracle, but now, the Democrats will be primed throughout the the midterms or whatever to blame inflation, which will probably still be raging by then, on Republicans. So that's what they're trying to do. They're putting themselves in a win-win situation. And the best way that we can combat that is just knowing the facts and the reality of it, that this isn't an inflation bill. But, again, for your average American, the headlines kind of tell most of the story. So just wanted to point that out. I think that's probably going to be the most important aspect of this, just your average person. And they're good at what they do when it comes to these linguistical battles. So let's let's address some low-hanging fruit about this bill first. So like I said, this is not an inflation bill. The one pager says multiple times, it's a one pager, says multiple times that they're going to decrease carbon emissions by 40% by 2030, but it never estimates how much inflation is going to be reduced. It's kind of interesting, right? I mean, I know that's a little bit harder of a thing to calculate, but they don't even attempt it. So the best number that's being touted by the administration comes from Moody's Analytics that suggests that the bill would lower inflation by 0.33 percentage points by 2031. So we covered last episode, or maybe the episode before that, I think it was the last episode, that the newest inflation numbers was 9.1%, 9.1. So this bill in full effect in 9 years from now would lower that 9.1% to 8.7, and I'm rounding in their favor. so that's like, if you don't need any more proof than that this is not an inflation bill. And you might think, well, maybe this is a conservative estimate, that maybe there's some estimates that are actually a little bit more rosy when it comes to inflation reduction. No, this is the number that's being promoted by the Biden administration officials. It's being retweeted by administration officials, and we even have a video of people in the administration referring to this projection by Moody's as their proof that this is going to lower inflation. So let's go ahead and play clip 1 there, Andy.
University of Pennsylvania, Wharton School, doing a measure of this Inflation Reduction Act, says actually it's not much of a reduction act at all. In fact, it may increase inflation marginally.
Well, economists have various models. One of the things that we see is that they do not say that it's going to increase inflation. There's also new data coming out from Moody's.com this morning from Mark Zandi, where he's already indicated that his model actually does show that it will lean into inflation reduction. And here's the thing. Core parts of this legislation are going to give significant relief to families by continuing to extend the subsidies to health care through the Affordable Care Act. That will certainly help families that are struggling with costs. Giving the government the ability to negotiate over prescription drugs, that's going to help families with costs. And of course, all of the energy investments that are going to provide rebates to families who are looking to make that transition to clean energy. This legislation is going to lower those energy costs over time, make them less volatile. So it's difficult to imagine that this bill does not significantly support family economic security and help families cope with the high costs of living.
Pause that and keep it on the screen. Pause that and keep it on the screen. I love it. If people watching on TV, look at all those negative red numbers. Look, the Dow is down 46. I mean, every part of the market is like, oh God, this is a disaster. And they're all down. So I love how they put that box on CNBC. Bravo.
I'm glad that Aaron from the late seasons of The Office was able to get a job in the Biden administration. So that's a good thing. Yeah. But it's pretty crazy that the response to this idea that the bill might actually increase inflation is no. Moody says it's going to decrease it by 0.33 percentage points. That's quite a selling point. What do you think about this, Jim?
Well, note that she didn't mention exactly how much Moody said. And by the way, these are all projections. I mean, you can either go at a project, and then the projections. Look, the reason they say that this is going to reduce inflation is because supposedly this bill would reduce the federal deficit by $300 billion over 10 years or 9 years, I think it is. And reducing the deficit has a deflationary effect on the economy overall. But $300 billion, look, let's put this in perspective. We already spent $1.9 trillion on the American Rescue Plan that Biden had in there. We spent another $1 trillion on the infrastructure bill. And now this thing is another $750 billion. And they're saying that inflation will not increase. The year Obama was elected, the entire federal budget was $3.7 trillion. And we went from 4.7 trillion just in 2019 before the pandemic to now the latest federal expenditures was $6.8 trillion. And I'm supposed to get excited about a reduction of the deficit by $300 billion over 10 years. And if it actually happens, if you think that this is actually going to happen, you deserve, I don't know, you don't deserve to live in an economy this bad. But you have to open your mind and read and understand what's going on here. This is all smoke and mirrors, and it's a complete sham. The spending already, if you take them at face value, the spending far outpaces, and the spending is immediate, far outpaces any so-called deficit reduction. So the inflationary effects of the spending, which we have already experienced, the United States had higher inflation rate than any of our peers in Western Europe. Why? Because they didn't pass a $2 billion rescue plan and another $1 trillion infrastructure plan immediately after doing all their COVID spending. That's why their inflation was lower than ours. Now, if you think that, saving, and the savings is never going to come, guys. It's never going to come. It never, ever comes. We don't ever reduce the deficit that way. The only way to do that is to grow the economy. Every time we have reduced the deficit or even run a surplus, it's because the economy grew faster than the smarty pants economists thought it would, thanks to reducing government spending and lowering taxes and getting the economy going. That's how it always works. That's how it works every single time. So this idea that the government can control inflation and control economic growth by how much they spend in the economy, that's Keynesian bullcrap. And it has never been proven to work. So, actually, the clip goes on. I actually didn't find the clip because Joe Kernan, I believe is his name, from CNBC, he went right at her with real economics and said that, you're full of crap. And she is. This entire thing is a complete sham. And again, as I said at the top of the podcast, if this passes, the economic pain we're feeling right now will be even worse. We're doing the exact opposite of what needs to be done to get this economy back in shape.
Well, what's funny is, like, even by the administration's own rhetoric, like, this piece of legislation is not going to exist in a vacuum. So even if we do experience $300 billion in savings over the next 10 years or something like that, like, Biden's also pursuing a potential, like, mass forgiveness of student loans.
Yeah, why not?
The plan that's being floated recently is, like, for everyone that's got student loans, it's like $10,000 in forgiveness. What's the cost of that? Is that going to outpace the supposed savings that we're going to get? Is that going to counteract all of the inflation that we're supposed to be reducing with this bill? Like, it's just, like, it's absurd just on its face. And that's just taking their words at face value, Justin, feel free to weigh in on this. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that, obviously this has nothing to do with inflation, in reducing inflation. That's apparent. No one is even, when you talk about inflation, you don't talk about inflation 10 years from now in the future. That's not how anybody talks about this. I think it's interesting that even in their framing of it, it's the Inflation Reduction Act. They're reducing inflation. That's what they're saying, right? But what we want is deflation. From this point, we don't actually want inflation at all anymore, because we've had 2 years of inflation that's been crazy high. And so their pie in the sky promise is we're not going to go back to what it was 2 years ago or a year ago or 6 months ago. Those days that's over. The price increases 15, 20%, 25%, depending on how you want to measure CPI. All that stuff's here to stay. But 10 years from now, if we pass this bill, things will be slightly better than they would otherwise be, assuming no other changes in society or the world or other bills or other spending programs or anything other like that. I mean, assuming none of that stuff happens, it'll be slightly better. But even in their best case scenario, they're not saying we're going to fix the damage we already caused. They're just saying we're going to stop the damage from getting worse, but just by a little bit and 10 years into the future. So that's just ridiculous. I will say this though. I think what they're trying to do, if you're actually going to look at what they're saying and try to put the best spin on it for them, what they're saying is that they're going to their prescription drug pricing reform thing, where they're going to allow the government to negotiate drug prices. That's going to lower costs. So prices are going to go down in that area. When they say that they're going to, have Affordable Care Act subsidies are going to be extended, ones that were recently temporarily passed through the coronavirus relief legislation, that's going to keep prices of insurance premiums lower than they would otherwise be. So, I mean, while there is some truth to that, probably, okay, the cost of doing that is raising prices in other areas. And that's actually built into their own legislation, their own proposal. So, for example, when they say that they're going to pay for this by having, in part, having a 15% corporate minimum tax so that all corporations, regardless of the deductions they would otherwise have or tax credits they would otherwise have, are going to pay at least 15%. All right. Put aside for a moment whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, but they'll pay at least 15%. That's a tax increase on some very, very large corporations that employ lots and lots of people, sell lots of products and goods and services. Well, that's going to more likely than not increase prices that those companies sell, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe drug prices for some people go down, but prices for all people that buy from these corporations go up, and it's all just part of the math that they're doing, right?
Sure.
The same, even the Affordable Care Act subsidies. When you give someone a subsidy so that it creates distortion in the health insurance marketplace, the insurance companies and hospital systems are then forced to raise revenues from other areas, and all of this kind of offsets. Somebody pays it, is the point that I'm trying to get at. So even their own legislation, somebody is paying for all of this in some fashion. So what Democrats love to do, though, or what liberals love to do, and Democrats just happen to be lots of liberals in that party, is they love to sort of twist and turn the control panel of the economy in order to benefit this group over here and punish this group over there. And we're going to promote green energy, but we're going to destroy all these fossil fuel jobs over here in order to do it. And in the end, don't worry, we've got some academic study that says that there's a 0.11% increase in, whatever in our or decrease in inflation in 10 years. So it's all worth it. And it's actually going to benefit everybody else. But how can anybody really know? It's just more likely than not that if you just look at the past 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 1,000 years of governments trying to put these policies in place, and you just look at the effects of them, you can see common sense should tell you that these things never, ever work the way they promise that they work. Yes, some people will benefit from it. That's how government handouts and manipulations and cronyism works. In cronyism, someone does benefit. That's right. The people benefiting from the cronyist arrangement benefit from it. And so do the politicians that get rewarded for having the cronyism. Right. But in general, most people are worse off, and it creates lots of distortions and causes lots of big economic problems. And the biggest, best proof of how the government's manipulation and control of the economy and getting involved in all of these things screws things up is the very inflation crisis that they claim that this bill is going to have a tiny little positive impact on in 10 years into the future. This is solely, completely, 100% the result of government interaction. They destroyed the economy on purpose by shutting it down. They printed more money than they have ever printed in the entire history of humanity to pay for people to basically stay home and have their jobs destroyed and not do any work at all for a year and a half or more. Then they paid people as a stimulus package. They sent people checks in the mail who didn't even lose their jobs, even though the economy was closed and there was no place for them to spend it. So they just stuck it in the bank. Gee, maybe that is one of the reasons why we're having inflation problems. They printed tons and tons of money and then pumped it through central banks into corporations and the banking and financial sector, making all of those people really rich. But that money filters back into the economy, causes more inflation. The list goes on and on and on. The point is, the reason we have historic inflation we haven't seen in 40 or 50 years right now, is because the government has been meddling in the economy. So the solution to government meddling is not more government meddling. I don't know why people don't see that. It should be common sense at this point. But if there was ever a perfect lesson for this, it's what we've seen over the past 3 years. The more the government gets involved, the more the central banks get involved, the more they manipulate and try to control things, the more subsidies and the more buyouts and handouts and welfare programs that they expand and all of that stuff. The more they do those things, the more they create distortions that have long-term detrimental effects on everyone. And that's what people are suffering from right now. So we need to stop doing that, go in a completely different direction, like Calvin Coolidge did way back at the beginning of the 20th century when he was dealing with an economic crisis, and they actually cut government spending. Can you imagine that today when we have a economic crash and you cut government spending as a way to help spur economic growth? That's what he did, and it led to the roaring 1920s. So that's what we need. We don't need more government screwing things up. We need less government screwing things up.
Yeah. So, Justin, can you phrase that in a way that's as short as we have inflation and voters and Republicans voted against the Inflation Reduction Act?
No.
Exactly. But that's the position that we're in. Again, it's a rock and a hard place, unfortunately. But you're absolutely right in everything that you said. There's no doubt about that.
These politicians don't like a free market, or as free a market as can be in modern society, because they can't control it. I mean, they don't like these energy subsidies are a great example of it. It's like, we don't like coal and natural gas. So we're going to tax the hell out of that. And we're going to take, we're going to subsidize energy that we do like. It doesn't matter whether it can actually provide energy for your economy. This is what we want to do. And we will implement policies to punish economic activity that we do not personally favor, or maybe financially favor, because it's these green energy companies. It's a circulation of money between the subsidies and the donations to their own campaign coffers. It's funny that the environmental left is always talking about the dirty coal money. Like Joe Manchin, he's just bought and paid for by big coal. It's like, well, you are in the Constitution allowed redress of grievances to your government. But I mean, if I'm a coal company or I work for a coal company, and 80% of my economy in the state of West Virginia depends on the coal industry, I might want to support politicians who will protect my industry from the green lunatics who are running agencies in the federal government and also in Congress and the federal government. But we had David Harsanyi is a friend of mine. He's a syndicated columnist. We run his column at Heartland Daily News. That's heartlanddailynews.com. I was looking at his piece. I think it's in the show notes. And he pointed out something I'd forgotten about, which is really interesting. He said, hey, actually, you guys, you remember when the Democrats and Biden and the administration were all saying that inflation is transitory? And that was because they were trying to sell their $5.5 trillion Build Back Bolshevik plan that had the Green New Deal in it and a bunch of other stuff in it. The reason they were saying that inflation was transitory back then is because they knew all that spending would be identified and picked out as being inflationary. So they called it transitory, saying, don't worry about it. It's going to go away. It's going to go away. Let's go ahead and pass this big bill. So then when inflation didn't go away, they put about 75% of the same deal into this other bill and call it the Inflation Reduction Act. So if you're falling for this, I got a used car that's rusting out, but probably worth $30,000 of your money in the back parking lot over here.
Yeah, so I want to race through a handful of things before we get into what that bill actually is, and you already kind of mentioned some of that there, Jim. But I keep referencing this. What was the Moody's Analytics thing? The 0.33 percentage points reduction in inflation in 10 years. So that's, of course, not the only estimate out there. There's a couple more projections that suggest that this has the potential to increase inflation. So I have an article here. Andy, you don't have it. This is a late edition. This is from the Cato Institute talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. And the article talks about a couple of estimates, one by the budget modelers at Penn Wharton, which I think is the estimate that was brought up in that first clip that we played, and another one by the Tax Foundation. So these estimates suggest that deficit reductions are going to be far more modest than that $300 billion in that Senate Democrats one-pager that I mentioned. So the Penn Wharton one says that the expected deficit reduction should be closer to $86 billion by 2031 at most. The Tax Foundation calculates that just 1% of the expected deficits over the next decade should be expected. And then reading from it, it says both Tax Foundation and Penn Wharton find that the Senate bill would actually increase deficits in the first few years. Increase deficits in the first 3 years, and thus have the opposite effect on inflation as the reduction promised by the bill's title. So the article says, but despite its name, the Senate bill would not reduce inflation because it would damage the supply side and hardly affect deficits at all. So as Jim mentioned, and Justin, that whatever rosy projections that these politicians put out in regards to their proposed legislation, the reality always is outpaced by the projection. So you never see the deficit reductions as much as they're promising. You never see the revenue generation as high as they're promising. All of that. And we have another video that kind of highlights another criticism of the proposed legislation, and that is the idea that the Joint Committee on Taxation projects the effects of the legislation will increase the burden on people making well under $400,000 a year. So let's go ahead and play clip 2.
Is President Biden thinking about pulling his support for the Inflation Reduction Act?
No.
Because he promised it wasn't going to raise taxes on anybody making less than $400,000 a year, but the Joint Committee on Taxation says that is not true.
Well, that isn't correct.
So the Joint Committee on Taxation, which you guys heralded as an effective body when you were selling the infrastructure package, is not to be trusted here.
I said it is not correct because I will give you why it's not correct, because it is incomplete. The JCT report that we're currently seeing is incomplete because it omits the actual benefits that Americans would receive when it comes to prescription drugs, when it comes to the lowering energy costs like utility bills. It does not include that.
Yeah, no, oh gosh.
See, that's what I was saying. That's exactly what I was saying. Yeah. I mean, that's the argument. The argument is, well, these subsidies and these handouts and stuff are going to benefit people. So yeah, so if you spend a ton on prescription drugs and you happen to take prescription drugs that will benefit from this arrangement, and not all of them will, but some of them will, then you're not building that into your inflation calculate. Well, that's because that's not how you calculate inflation. That's not how it works. So, of course, that's not what we're doing. But that's going to be the argument. The argument is we're going to give benefits to some people. And so any talk of reducing inflation has to include those benefits. But that's ridiculous. I mean, if we just took, let's say that we, passed a bill that gave everybody in America who is under 6 feet tall $1,000. Could you call that a reduction in inflation? Or you gave them $1,000 to buy groceries? Would that be a reduction in inflation? Because for those people, they're paying less on groceries. Well, no, of course it's not. That's not how inflation. That's not how it works. That's how it works. Of course it's not. But that's the argument they're going to make because, again, they think we're stupid, and some people are.
It's absurd. It really is absurd.
Let's also remember what this is kind of getting glossed over, but what's in this bill is something that Democrats have wanted for a long time, which is basically giving the government de facto monopoly power to negotiate prescription drug prices through Medicaid and Medicare. This is price controls. When have price controls ever worked? All that's going to happen is you're going to have prescription drugs that are very important to a lot of people. We're a pharmacologically saturated culture in the United States. But all that's going to do is going to make pharmaceuticals more scarce and more expensive. That's what price controls do to any product every single time. And so that you can have that to look forward to. All the other good news in this bill.
Yeah. No. So let's talk about what the bill really is. So we've got an article here from the Heartland Daily News, heartlanddailynews.com. Inflation Reduction Act or Radical Green New Deal. So this is an opinion piece that was written by Jack Spencer, who is a senior research fellow for energy and environmental policy at the Heritage Foundation. He says that this bill is mostly just a list of hundreds of pages of tax credits, subsidies, and regulations for the energy choices preferred by the DC elites, such as wind and solar, while increasing the cost to access more reliable, more abundant energy sources like gas and oil on federal lands. And I got another article here. Andy, you don't have this one, but it talks a little bit more in depth about this list of different subsidies and everything like that. It says the bill extends existing renewables energy tax credits, production tax credits, and investment tax credits, and contains other important climate and energy provisions, standalone energy storage, biogas, property, microgrid controllers, dynamic glass, and small interconnected facilities would become eligible for the investment tax credit Bonus tax credits are available for certain projects located in the brownfield and coal mining communities for the small wind and solar projects placed in service in certain low-income communities. Bonus tax credits are also available for some investments if additional goals are met for domestic content and labor standards, which means prevailing wages and apprenticeships for create skilled jobs and blah, 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 blah. So it's just a laundry list of all these different handouts from the government to help bolster the renewable energy sector and all of that stuff. So it's the same old story. But, just to kind of, take a few bits out of one of Justin's big rants there. It's like the government created this massive problem of inflation, and then they pretend like they're going to solve this massive problem of inflation by doing something that they've been wanting to do for a long time, just slapping the idea of inflation reduction on top of it. It's really insidious. Like, if you didn't want to prescribe just ignorance to these people, you have to subscribe malice to these people. This is really, really underhanded. Even by politician standards, it's underhanded. But Jim, one more thing that was his name, Jack Spencer, whoever wrote that article, said that that a more accurate title for this bill should be the Radical Green New Deal. So, Jim, is that the sense that you get when you from the stuff that you've read and the energy and climate people that you've talked to?
Well, yeah. Well, let's just put it this way. If John Kerry really loves this bill, then it's really bad. And he really likes this bill.
A good rule of thumb.
Really, that's always a good rule of thumb. Yeah, he's like the George Costanza of American policy. If John Kerry likes it, run in the other direction. Look, in this bill, renewables get $30 billion in subsidies. And let's kind of get this out of the way right now. It's a myth that you hear this from the environmental left all the time, that we're providing subsidies to oil and gas industries. We need to stop that. These so-called subsidies are the deductions that an oil company or a coal company or a natural gas extraction company take to invest into their equipment. It's the basic write-offs every other business gets. The subsidies, if you want to call them that, but the tax breaks and all of that stuff, all the benefits to solar and to wind especially, are far and beyond those kind of basic business write-offs that an oil and natural gas company should naturally have. That's how you encourage more investment, and then you actually raise more tax revenue from these people. But this bill raises the taxes on coal and natural gas producers. So it makes there's a chart here up on here. Got this from the Texas Public Policy Foundation here up on YouTube. Federal subsidies per unit of electricity generated from 2010 to 2019. Solar is $82.46 per unit of electricity generated. Oil and natural gas is 0.39, so 39 cents, put it that way, subsidies per unit of electricity generated. So we are subsidizing energy that doesn't work. And you have to believe that this is the plan. I mean, they're actually raising taxes in this bill on coal and natural gas companies, making it harder for them to get reliable energy out of the ground and onto our grid so that we can keep our lights on and our air conditioning on and our heat on in the winter. This is what the left has always wanted. They've always wanted to keep it in the ground. The keep it in the ground movement has never really ended. They're just finding other ways to do it. This bill is one way to get down that road. You keep subsidizing energy that doesn't work. You keep punishing the production of energy that does work, and then you end up in utopia. It's like the underpants gnomes from South Park. It's like you keep skipping the middle part here, and that's the thing that's so infuriating about Joe Manchin, is that he came out last week. He was so proud of himself. I have come to a compromise. It's the Neville Chamberlain kind of compromise. He says, I've always made, I made sure that we're not just going to make this immediate transition into wind and solar, into so-called renewables, that we're going to be able to continue to still produce reliable energy while we transition to this new place. The environmental left and these people are laughing their heads off at that moron, because he just got suckered, and the rest of us is going to be suckered too. The energy grid is now, if this passes, the energy grid is going to be less reliable, a lot faster than we were already heading that way. In fact, you know what? They also tax import of crude oil as well. So if you think Joe Biden and the Democrats care about how much you're paying at the pump for gasoline, they don't. They're going to make that more expensive too. This is such a disaster. Just about every bad idea in the massive Green New Deal is in here. They just kind of condensed it, boiled it down to the absolute worst and threw it in here.
Justin, before you say anything, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I really want to get to the Ron DeSantis ESG stuff. So keep it brief.
All I'll say is that, and this is something we've talked about before, but it's just so important to re-emphasize this point that this entire debate about green energy is to transition to this massive new system that will, at best, provide us with exactly the same service we already have in exactly the same way. That's it. That's what it is. Sure. So that when I turn my lights on, they work. When I turn my television on, it works. The best case scenario is that we spend trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars so that everything stays exactly the same at exactly the same cost, except we have to spend trillions of dollars to get there. And the worst part is it's not going to. It's going to be much more expensive. But think about how insane it is that that's the debate we're having. Like, that's an insane debate to have. Totally insane.
Yeah, well, I had a couple of other things in my show notes here. There's little like silver linings aspects to some oil and gas leasing. There are some details in this bill, provisions in this bill that are kind of interesting to discuss. But for the sake of time, we're going to skip that. Also, 15% minimum tax on corporations. Is that a good or a bad idea? I thought that might have been a good discussion. But again, for sake of time, we're going to skip that. And because I want to get to this other topic. This is ESG related. So, Justin, your biggest opponent in the last couple of years has been the concept of ESG. You and Glenn Beck wrote about this extensively in your book, The Great Reset, Joe Biden and the Rise of 21st Century Fascism. Check it out if you haven't seen that already. It's also over Justin's shoulder there. So hopefully at this point, we don't have to cover yet again what ESG exactly is. If you want a basic primer on this, we have several videos about it on Stopping Socialism TV on YouTube. But we've also talked about how ESG was able to gain so much ground because it largely flew under the radar for years and years. So with the release of the book, as well as all the work that the Heartland Institute's been doing to expose ESG for what it is, a way to centrally control the economy, it is finally starting to catch on. So when Florida Governor Ron DeSantis comes out like a week or so ago and bashes ESG, you must have been pretty excited, right?
Yeah. I think this is a huge a win for not just the Heartland Institute. That's really not that important if it's a big win for us. It's more important that's a big win for America, Jim. Put the people first. I think that ESG is truly one of the biggest threats to individual freedom and free markets and business freedom that America has faced in a very, very, very long time. I do not say that lightly. I really do truly believe this. It is essentially a social credit scoring system designed to put elites and financial institutions and central banks and government in charge of virtually everything in society through corporations and the products and goods and services and things like that they can offer. And what you can say on social media platforms and what sorts of books Amazon sells. There's all kinds of things that are related to ESG. And the more it expands, the more dangerous it's going to become. And so to see someone of the stature of Ron DeSantis come out strongly opposed to ESG, saying, in effect, the state of Florida is not going to send public funds to people who are promoting ESG, to support ESG investments and things like that, which is common sense because it's bad for Florida's economy. So why would you deliberately undermine your own economy by funding ESG? But that's exactly what's been going on. And to say that that in Florida, banks and financial institutions, which have a tremendous amount of power, are not going to be able, not just banks, but credit card companies, money transmitters like PayPal, all those kinds of companies are not going to be able to discriminate against customers on the basis of their religion or their politics or their social beliefs. I think that is absolutely huge. I do wish there was more included in it, and we can get into that probably in another time because we're running out of time here. I do think that there could be more done in it. It doesn't do enough. There's more work to be done on this, but the bill hasn't actually been formally proposed yet. So hopefully by the time it does get formally proposed, it'll be a little bit better than the proposal that he's been putting out so far. But regardless of all of that, it is huge that someone like Ron DeSantis and the state of Florida, because there are a lot of lawmakers in Florida too, who are already signed on to this, big believers in it. They've been working really hard on putting together legislation for this. So this is a huge, huge win. And if Ron DeSantis runs for president, and there's a pretty good chance that he will, there is a high likelihood that this could end up in an actual presidential platform. And that would be massive for exposing the country to this issue. We are on a trajectory that is what I thought was sort of the best case scenario trajectory a year and a half ago, when you and I, Donnie, would have these phone calls. Nobody knew what ESG was, basically, except for insiders and Klaus Schwab, and his assistant. And we would have these conversations like, what's the best case scenario in all of this? And we're sort of living that out. I mean, we literally said to each other at one point, getting it into a presidential platform is one of the best case scenarios, because if it becomes part of that, it could actually become federal law at some point. That's how you elevate an issue. And we're seeing that play out in record time. Absolutely incredible.
Right. ESG is the backbone to the Great Reset, which we've been talking about for years now. And I think you understated like the conversations that you and I had over the phone, because I'm pretty sure we very specifically said, like, wouldn't it just be amazing if Ron DeSantis like ran for president?
We did.
And he like used, the anti-ESG stuff was like part of his like platform for his campaign. Like, we are getting close to that possibility, man.
Yeah.
We're getting very close. Jimmy, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I think that this, as discouraging as it can be, and I get grumpy. Gosh, there's a news flash. Looking at what's happening in Washington, D.C., especially with this bill, what Ron DeSantis is proposing can be proposed all over the country. In fact, it is being proposed all over the country. You can fight back at ESG on all sorts of levels in all sorts of localities. Justin, a New York Times reporter has reached out to the Heartland Institute because they have identified us as one of the leading organizations informing local and state governments and state government officials on how they can fight this ESG madness. We have been, for instance, something you wouldn't even think of. The treasurer of a state, the treasurer of the state of Utah and the treasurer of the state of West Virginia. I can't speak to Utah because I don't know quite what has just happened recently, but just last week, the treasurer in West Virginia, after legislation was passed in the state legislature, said, "Okay, great. If you are a bank that puts ESG as a priority instead of your fiduciary duty, you're not doing any business with any state entity in West Virginia." I know Ron DeSantis has talked about this. He even talked about it, I think I saw, in the context of, you know what, if Florida did that and Texas did that and joined West Virginia and then maybe Utah, that starts to have a real impact. That turns into trillions of dollars of assets from these big banks like Vanguard and BlackRock that they have to start taking seriously. So it would be great if ESG and battling ESG was part of a presidential campaign and part of the, the Republican Party's platform, I suppose, or Ron DeSantis' platform. But it doesn't have to, that's not the only avenue to get something done. You could do this on the state level. The Heartland Institute is doing this on the state level. And watch your local New York Times story, which is probably going to be a hit piece on Heartland any day now.
Yeah, and I would argue, really, we can't afford to wait for this to be resolved at the federal level because A, there's no guarantees that it ever will be. B, we've seen, we're still waiting for free market healthcare reform. When's that happening? We've been waiting for that for a long, long time. So if you rely on the federal government to get the job done for you, whether you're on the left or on the right, you're going to be sorely, sorely disappointed. We hope that Congress is paying attention to this, Republicans in Congress. We hope that presidents are paying attention, or future presidents are paying attention to this, whether that's Ron DeSantis or somebody else. But at the end of the day, I really don't think that we could have hoped for anything better than what's been going on with this. We have 24 states paying attention to this, 24 treasurers roughly paying attention to this issue. We've got potential presidential candidates paying attention to it. We have the New York Times calling us up on the phone, asking for us writing stories about what's been going on with this issue, all on a topic that nobody cared about a year and a half ago. Not because it didn't matter, but because people didn't know. And that's I mean, just incredible.
And if you like work this way back, it's like, yes, you can attribute this to like politicians at these state levels and now even higher up levels, like noticing that this is like acknowledging that this is like a terrible thing that we have to fight back against. You can go a step back further and say like the work of the Heartland Institute to get these people at this state level to acknowledge that this is terrible and fight back against it. You can go back even further to, like Justin and I kicking these things or this idea around and working with Glenn Beck on this book to make this thing a little bit more higher profile. But that all stems from the World Economic Forum themselves repeating this term, the Great Reset, over and over again. It was an unforced fumble error on their end. Keep repeating this very insidious, conspiratorial sounding phrase, the Great Reset, which alerted you to it. And that was the start of all of this. So it's
pretty crazy. Pretty crazy.
We have to mention that. We have to mention that.
Yeah.
But
marketing matters, people. Marketing matters.
They live in a complete bubble. They've probably using the Great Reset terminology for 20 years before anybody heard it in the last 5 years.
Yep. All right, that music means that we are out of time. It actually means that we're long on time here. So I want to thank you all for tuning into this episode of the In the Tank podcast. Again, for those audio-only listeners that are catching this on a Friday, join us live on Thursdays at noon on YouTube and Rumble and Twitter and Facebook or wherever. You can put in your comments. Maybe we'll show your comments on the screen. Maybe we'll address your questions on the fly. If you'd like, you can follow us on Twitter at In The Tank Pod. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for the show, feel free to email us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Jim Lakely, where can the fine people find you?
At J Lakely on Twitter, at Heartland Inst on Twitter, and always visit heartland.org.
Justin Haskins, same question.
At Justin T. Haskins on Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Getter, and everything else under the sun.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you next week.